I'm so excited to talk to you about the book.
Yeah, so am I. So am I.
Yeah.
So the narrator of The Optimists is a man named Rod Keating, and The Optimist is a novel, but in real life there was a man named Rod Keating whom I first met when I was in eighth grade, and he was my eighth grade English teacher. And he completely changed the way I saw life and literature and education. But before him, teachers were intimidating folks I wanted to please. And here he came with his sort of performative aspect and, marching up and down the aisles and spouting Shakespeare and getting us enthusiastic about it. And he really made me see not only the literature come alive, but he made me see teachers as people who were their own individual human beings who could take different approaches to teaching and who met us individually, as students. So he made a real mark on my life. We stayed in touch. And then after I graduated with my MFA, he knew I needed a way to make, healthcare and rent money, and he shoehorned me in to teach alongside him a class of eighth graders. And I never would have imagined wanting to do that before, but I fell in love with it. And then for 4 years, he sat in on my classes, he mentored me, he became a good friend. We talked about, pedagogical approaches and literature and writing and how to correct students' writing and my own. He read. He became a reverend to perform my marriage to my wife. Um, a week after which he had a massive stroke and never spoke again. He couldn't communicate by writing or by speech or in sign language any way at all. So I would spend a decade of time with him. Once a week or so, I'd come over to his place and read to him and talk to him about former students and what was going on at school and what I was working on in my growing family, et cetera. And I was just obsessed with this question about what was going on in his mind. So I would come home and I would write, excerpts and attempts of figuring out, what various things he could be thinking. Uh, and that was the origin of the project. I realized shortly thereafter that in order for it to be a compelling novel, there needed to be a plot and, the reader caring about, what was going to happen next and how it would happen. And that's where a love story came in. And essentially what The Optimist is it's a book narrated by a man at the end of his life trying to entertain the reader best he can with stories about these fantastic students from his past and their successes, failures, love, etc. It came in stages. So as I mentioned, the first stage was just this, brain dump of everything I imagined he might be thinking as I was monologuing to him over the course of the years. And that wasn't readable. I didn't know what it was for. I didn't know whether it was for me or his family or just a way for me to psychologically process it. When I decided there needed to be plot, I somewhat artificially, went back to textbook basics and figured out, who wanted what and what would be the obstacle to them achieving that. And then once they achieved some of it or couldn't, what would be the next obstacle. And I I architected out, what read to me like a novel. And it was lacking all of the I don't know, all of the love and imagination of the first draft. And I was really stuck on that for a while until I realized that the fictional Mr. Keating would share my anxieties in how to tell this story. And once I realized that he would be frustrated in his inability to remember some parts and his inability to tell a story without interrupting it, I realized that I could use that as the narrative mechanism where there'd be a plot and then he would almost be overwhelmed by the telling of the story and say, but wait, before I continue, you need to know this. Or, I want to tell you this, but that reminds me of a time when I was younger. Or I'm writing about the love of these two characters, but really what I should be writing about is my love for my wife. And then it all came together because I had the plot mapped out. I had this voice that was desperate to be heard. And then I had the sort of the playfulness of the real man that I remember spending, those hundreds of hours with, who would want to make sure you knew not only the joke, but the analysis behind why the joke was funny, or not only the story he was telling, but the history of why that story makes sense. And that became tons of fun because it let me, have the architecture, but break through it a little bit and say, but hang on, I need to tell you this too. And that became a back and forth that I really enjoyed working with, that I think gives the book a lot of its energy in the end.
I think so too. And instead of creating discomfort as a reader of, oh, I'm being thrown forward and backward and where are we? And like,
Right.
there was none of that because it really felt natural to how stories are told.
And at
Um,
a certain point, my hope was that if you just trust this guy, that his desire is for you as a reader to have a good time, and you don't need to follow exactly when, what year, what occurred, and why. You just needed to know that there was a girl whom he thought had extraordinary potential, a guy who was in love with that girl, and sort of the unpredictability of her brilliance as she grew up from kindergartner to eighth grader to adult. It wasn't going to be hard to follow. You could sort of ride that wave and get a kick out of it in the way that the narrator hopes you do. And that I think, I achieved as best I could. It takes, 10, 15 minutes to be scolded by a teacher or to scold a student. I've been both. And those 15 minutes can have such an impact on both the teacher and the student for the next 50, 60, 80 years of their lives. And it's not just scolding. It's the first time, you think somebody might have a crush on you and how you handle that and how it feels and the combination of excitement and shame and anxiety. It's from that perspective, looking back at all of these years of his own life and then the lives of his students, part of what he's fascinated by, and of course what fascinates me as well, is the outsized importance of moments that in the moment have the intensity that I feel kids feel about almost everything. You mentioned you have a 2-year old. I have a 10 and 12-year old now, and everything is so incredibly urgent to them at that moment. And then it's an absolute mystery why 5, 10 years later, that's their memory, or that's what they have questions about, or that's what seems to have stuck. And in some ways, it's the magic of childhood. In some ways, it's I don't know, the horror of parenting that like at any of these moments could be significant in a way that you don't anticipate. And that's very, very exciting. And it's anxiety producing. And as parents, I think we feel it palpably. And as a society, I think that we know teachers are involved in those moments, and we want our teachers to influence our students and to encourage them and to build up, the best possible narratives for them and pathways. But I think we spend less time thinking about the fact that we throw these kids into a room with a teacher for a year, and some people are profoundly affected by their second grade teachers, and some people have no memory and nothing to say about it. And it's just that push and pull of the influence of parents and teachers over children has always fascinated me.
yeah. And do you think part of memorability has to do with like the way a person is experiencing time in that moment of their life?
Yes, I think that for some people, there are moments where time just slows down and it feels significant. And in other times you blink and it's over. I think that where this comes up the most to me is pandemic time, where I find so many people just with no memory at all of what occurred. And I have some of that where like I borrowed a car and I drove my kids to an outside area and they play. And I don't, if you told me that was 6 weeks, I would believe you. If you told me it was 5 days, I would believe you. And what memory my kids have of that. I think that there are within the regular contours of day-to-day life, there are these periods of time where every moment feels so important and meaningful. And then there are, other weeks, months, years that seem to go by where I couldn't tell you much of anything. I think he's remembering differently. One, because the storytelling mechanism that I create for him is one of great pressure, where there is such a mechanism in real life. It didn't work for the real Mr. Keating, but there's an eye tracking writing device, which when it works for people, it works, but it still takes tremendous concentration and it's exhausting for most of the people who need to use it. So there's a necessary focus that he has in telling the story, that he wants every detail, even if it's a joke, and he wants it all to be intentional and focused and precise. So that changes the way he tells the story. But then, Phil, sort of psychologically, the other storytelling change is that he knows he doesn't have so much time left, and he's trying to figure out what creates meaning, like what is important about the 70 plus years that he's lived. And that creates a certain different way of focusing. I think in a way that might be unhealthy in a day-to-day, routinized, quotidian, like manner. I think it'd become overwhelming to try to force so much meaning on different relationships and try to analyze or interpret what you're going through. But all he has is time. And when he can express himself, he only has a limited amount of space to express himself. And that combination, the truncated expression time and the unlimited contemplation time, leads to a very different way of remembering his past, I think.
Hmm. And on top of that, there's this third layer of time, which is sort of getting older and like time maybe ticking toward the end of life, which is maybe, different than like as the decades pass, maybe our relationship to that third time changes too.
Yes, and rarely do I go through all the years of students. If I've taught for 20 years, 50 kids a year, I think that gets to 1,000, right? And to even contemplate what that means that 1,000 students have been through my classroom is overwhelming. And I don't think I've ever really tried to parse that out and think of the individuals and all of those hours. But towards the end of somebody's life, when he's trying to validate his experience, those are 1,000 individuals whom he influenced or didn't, or had the opportunity to, or made a mistake or succeeded. And I think that you're right. It's that it's not forced contemplation, but that hunger for contemplation changes the nature of memory.
I have always lived so much in the future that now, though the future is so short, I can't get out of the habit. My gut reaction was like, "Oh, that's a really nice thing to say. That seems like a really optimistic statement." And then I sort of flipped it over and I was like, "Oh no, that's the most
Right.
pessimistic thing I've ever heard." And I like couldn't
It's
really
really
uh,
complicated, and I love that you called out that passage. No other readers have mentioned that one to me specifically, but it's one that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out myself. I read something similar in the memoirs of Somerset Maugham and had been sort of fighting through it, and then I realized when I wrote that sentence that it reminded me of something, and I went back to the mom and I went back to that sentence, and I was struggling with it, but there's something true about that to me, that so much of the pleasure of my life is anticipatory pleasure. It's imagining something. The classic is like looking forward to a vacation, but more than that, it's when you raise kids, so much of that pleasure is imagining when they're going to be able to talk, and then imagining when they're going to be able to actually express themselves, then imagining when they can sleep through the night or feed themselves or go to school, or what school's going to be like for them. So much of love is imagining a life together and growing old together, and getting that house and retiring, or the vacation, or whatever it is, that I think would be mixed on whether that's healthy or not. That there's the live for the moment crowd, where I believe that's wonderful. I think that anticipatory pleasure is a real pleasure and a valuable one. And part of the joy of raising kids and being in love and living is that knowledge that you get to look forward to stuff and play it out in different ways and try to create it. And that's wonderful, I think. But when you get to the end of your life and there stops being that opportunity to anticipate to the same degree, because you are physically limited and maybe neurologically limited and temporally limited, I don't know what one is supposed to do. That's when I guess that seize the day becomes more relevant. But I think days are probably more difficult to seize in that time of life as well. And I don't have an answer, but I agree. I think it's worth contemplating, and it felt right to me that the character was contemplating it in that moment.
Yeah, and he says in a different moment, like warm weather now is just warm weather. It doesn't have these connotations of like, oh, I must go outside. I must take advantage of this warm weather. It just
Well, which to him is is
yeah.
freeing
Yeah.
also, because he doesn't feel the pressure of, I mean, and that's straight from me. Like a lot of this
Yeah.
is him, but that feeling, I just remember so clearly one day when I was in college and I had all this work to do, and it was a beautiful day, and all these beautiful boys and girls and men and women were off doing fun things, and I felt almost the oppression of that opportunity, that like fuck, like I have, forgive me for cursing, I don't know,
Oh,
but
that's fine.
I have all this thing I need to do. I don't even really know how to have fun in the way that they seem to be having fun. And there was, now that I'm older, I figured out what makes me happy in a way that maybe I didn't know when I was 19. But the anxiety of springtime is a pressure he no longer needs to feel, which again is wonderful, but also kind of sad. And
Yeah.
that tension informs a lot of his optimism and his realism, and the tension between those two factors as well.
Yeah. It's interesting to have a character who is such a realist and also comes off as such an optimist in the end too, because even just simply thinking about the future or a future or the concept of future when basically every single day is the same is like a sense of yourself in the world and it's not over, like there's
Yes.
something else going to happen. And maybe that just on its own is a form of optimism in life, just like knowing that there is one, maybe not living in one, but like
It's
having,
also, I think, for some personality types, a necessary freedom of the boring, of the boredom of the present, right? Like as you're doing laundry and cleaning up and making meals for your kids and doing all like that is I love my kids more than anything in the world, but so much of parenting is so boring,
yeah.
and it's the anticipatory pleasure is a way to cut through the boredom sometimes. And chronic illness or age or suffering, I think, is its own type of boredom. And Keating's desire to tell this story is the way for him to cut through his boredom at the end of his life.
Mhm.
And although he might not have so many, exhilarating episodes ahead of him, he does have a new chapter to write tomorrow. And I think that enables a kind of optimism, that ability to look into the future for him and have a task to perform and a reason to get up and an enthusiasm behind all of that is an excitement and is a reason for optimism that he otherwise might not have. I think that writers in general, fiction writers especially, but I think I think all of us writers just are telling other people's stories with different versions of ourselves. And I don't think it's unique to writers. I think when we tell a story about our friend, or when we gossip, or when we talk about our kids, or an annoying boss, or whatever it is, we're really just telling different versions of how the universe is affecting us, or how, at the very most generous, it's changing our vision of the world, or something. But it does come down to the fact that the third person is almost always just a narrated first person. Like there's always a way that it's just an individual trying to articulate his or her their own perspective, even if they are mapping that perspective on another individual.